is, yeah, we're live. So, is it 11 o'clock yet? Yes, it is. Welcome, Facebook, to our first Facebook live session, which we might do more often if people want us to do it. We figured today we want people to be able to ask us pretty much everything. But let's try to stick to coffee brewing, especially. So if you have any questions about coffee brewing, whether it be brewing with AirPress, steep coffee, French press, espresso, V60, doesn't really matter. If no questions are stupid, so the only thing you might be able to see is I don't really know the answer, so I will try to give you a stupid answer. By the way, I'm Tim Wendelboe, and I run Tim Wendelboe in Oslo. So you might have heard of us if you're into coffee. If you're not that much into coffee, then you're probably not following us anyway, so it doesn't matter. But we specialize in importing very high-quality coffees from a couple of countries around the world, mainly Honduras, El Salvador, Colombia, and then Kenya and Ethiopia. And I personally go a lot to the farms to make sure that the coffee is exceptional. So the first tip of the day, for those of you who want to brew good coffee at home, make sure you use the best possible coffee beans you can get your hands on. Because it's very, very difficult to make good coffee if you don't have good coffee beans. Also, you need very, very good water. So here in Oslo, that's not a problem. But if you have a lot of calcium in your water, and you would know that if you just look into your water boiler or water kettle, if there's a lot of this kind of white stone-like material, that means you have a lot of calcium in your water. And you need to filtrate that out, otherwise your coffee will taste very earthy and not very bright and acidic. So my company is famous for doing light roasts, which is my personal preference, and that's why we do it. It's not a matter of roasting as light as possible, but it's I try to kind of get as little bitterness as possible into my coffee. And I want fruity flavors and sweetness to come through. And the way to do that is to roast the coffees quite light. But we do want it to be developed and sweet. So the problem with light roasted coffees a lot of times is that they are under roasted or not developed. So they might be very green in flavor. You can taste this kind of hay flavors. Sometimes people call it tobacco flavors, although that might also be a sign of the coffee being woody. So that means the green coffee actually is not so fresh anymore. So there's a lot of things that can happen with the green coffee as well, before roast or after roast. So let's see, there's one person, Gabriel Conti. Hi Tim, I love your coffee. I love V60 brew method. How important is temperature stability during brewing? Well, if you ask the Norwegian Coffee Association, who are testing automatic coffee brewers, they are very, very picky when it comes to brew water temperature, and they want it to be between 92 to 96 all the way through the brewing process. And this is impossible because as soon as you pour hot water onto room temperature coffee grounds, the brewing temperature in the slurry, where the coffee grounds and the water is kind of together in the filter, that's going to drop quite a lot. So I always recommend just use as hot water as possible. So straight from the water kettle. Don't be afraid of boiling the water. The oxygen doesn't disappear. If it did, it wouldn't be water anymore. It would be hydrogen. So H2O, the oxygen is still there. The free oxygen, however, will disappear, but that disappears through the boiling process anyway. So even before you reach the boiling point, most of that free oxygen has evaporated from the water. So I recommend as hot as possible. However, if you have very dark roasted coffees, you might get a lot of bitterness from that. So that's why I think a lot of people prefer to use a little bit lower brew water temperature when they do a little bit darker roast. So you reduce the bitterness, you kind of get more acidity out and so on. But if you do light roasted coffees like we do, and if they are roasted well, which, sometimes we are also not hitting the spot 100%, But if they're roasted well and they're light in color, then you should be able to just use as hot water as possible. You can also go a little bit lower, but try to experiment a little bit. With manual brewing methods, especially like V60, you will see a huge drop in water temperature, especially if you're using a glass or a ceramic filter holder. So because the glass or porcelain is actually stealing a lot of temperature. You can use the plastic ones; where you don't lose as much temperature. But regardless of how we do it, even if you preheat the filter and everything, you will have evaporation, and you're brewing in normal room temperature normally. So of course the water is going to drop in temperature. The most important part is that the coffee tastes good at the end. So don't worry too much about it. Let's see some other ones. Doug Stolhand, what's your recommended ratio of grounds to water when brewing coffee in a French press? Do you remove the coffee from the press after a certain time to prevent bitterness? Interesting. I always recommend 65 grams per liter as the standard ratio. However, when you do full immersion brews like French press, I always go up a little bit just to get a little bit the same strength that I prefer when I do filter coffee with 65 grams per liter. This is due to the fact that when you have remaining water in the French press, that kind of brewed coffee is the same strength as what you poured out of the French press. Whereas if you do filter coffee, the last water coming out of a filter is much weaker than the first water. So that's why we need to have a little bit different ratios when we brew. But I personally like kind of a strong TDS, so around 70 grams per liter when I do full immersion brews, 65 to 70 grams. And when I do filter brews, I do 60 to 65 grams. It's, the standard is 65 grams. I don't remove the coffee from the French press. I merely use it as a cupping. So I will just stir the crust of the coffee that's forming on top. I'll stir that after maybe, 3, 4, 5 minutes. Time is not so relevant. But the amount of times you stir has a lot to say on how much you extract. So with my method, I use quite a fine grind, like a cupping grind or a filter grind, and I stir maybe 3 to 5 times when I do the crust. Let everything sink to the bottom. I actually don't use the filter to press, and then after 5 minutes you can pour perfectly cleared coffee out of the French press. More questions?
What is the difference in taste and process between cold brew or hot brew, cooled down to iced coffee?
Ooh, interesting. So what is the difference in taste and process between cold brew or hot brew cooled down in iced coffee? Well, when you brew coffee with cold water, there are certain chemicals that you don't extract with the cold water as easily than if you use hot water. There is some research about this done very, very long time ago. Probably some newer stuff as well that I don't know. But in general, when you brew coffee with cold water, you tend to get a very kind of malty flavor, like malt whiskeys. Whereas if you brew the same coffee, let's say it's a Kenyan coffee, if you brew it with hot water, you get a lot more of the fruits, acidity, and the floral stuff. So personally, I prefer to always brew hot and then cool down. The problem is also after a while, the coffee starts to taste a little stale, and you develop quinic acids in coffee that's sitting around, so you kind of get a little bit of bitterness. So that's why I always prefer to add a little bit of sugar in those brews. With the cold brews, I also think, for me, it's always tasting a little kind of oxidized. So I'm not a huge fan of that myself.
How about from Mos and Satri, how about using 2 different temperature on pour-over methods? He said he's used 2 different temperatures while brewing, especially with the V60.
Yes. How about using 2 different temperature on pour-over methods? I have tested this using 2 different temperature while brewing, especially V60. Yeah, I've actually done some, I wouldn't call it experiments, but some tests myself, where I bloomed with very hot water on the V60 and then poured cooler water through. But the purpose of this particular test that I did was to make fruity iced coffee that is kind of more of a cold brew than an iced or cooled down hot coffee. I didn't really succeed that well, but I'm pretty sure you can get some good results. I'm just not sure why you would want to do that. Maybe if you brew huge amounts and you want huge amounts of cold coffee, you could, just brew some of it with hot water and then the rest with cold. I don't know. But, whatever makes you happy. If the coffee tastes great after using 2 different water temperature while brewing, do it. In espresso, we have been searching for the perfectly stable brew temperature coming out of the machine. And that was kind of the holy grail of making sweet espresso. But this is actually not happening because the coffee puck itself is normally room temperature or maybe maximum 40 to 50 degrees. So even if you have a very, very stable 93-degree brewing temperature on the water coming out of the brew pad, the coffee will cool the water down, and the portafilter will cool the water down. So perfectly stable brew temperature is not existing in that case. But the good thing about having it is that you know what temperature it is every time you brew. So in the past, when you brewed on a old Faema, for instance, which I started working with, the machine would slowly cool down the more you kind of used it. So yeah, I think it's better that you have stable temperatures.
Next one. For the pour over, do you recommend to create the ground wall or not?
For the pour over, do you recommend to create the ground wall or not?
Cheese thing again.
Cheesing. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I don't really understand what you're asking. For the pour over, do you recommend to create the ground wall or not? Yeah, I don't know. So, a lot of questions. I am not able to follow all of them. I visited your shop a while ago in Oslo, a few years ago, and loved the Espresso Martini. Sadly, I'm in Los Angeles and cannot visit often. How can I recreate that home? You can't. No, go get a Hamilton Beach old school milkshake mixer. Use 1 part espresso, 1 part milk, and a little bit of sugar, a little bit of ice, and then you just use the milkshake mixer on a very slow speed for about 1.5 minutes, and then you should have creamy, nice texture afterwards. And then some coffee grounds on top. So, Jordi?
What do you think is the most exciting evolution in coffee growing and processing?
Stuff like special fermentations, experience with yeast. Well, Jordi, I am not so excited about the processing methods that is going all over the place. The reason being, I think most of the stuff that I'm tasting, whether it's honey process, lactic fermentation, carbonic maceration, all this kind of fancy stuff, in my experience, they all taste of different versions of ferment. So it means you're kind of adding a flavor to the coffee. Also with the naturals, I think they get very fruity because of fermentation. And I'm not a huge fan of it. I sometimes can taste a very, very clean kind of peachy strawberry flavor from, last year I tasted 2 lots that had this on a natural that I kind of enjoyed, but I'm not a huge fan of it myself. Think of it as oak in wine. It's not part of the juice. You're kind of adding oak flavor, or maybe vanilla syrup in a coffee cup. You would just add a little bit of vanilla flavor with some syrup after the coffee is brewed. Well, this is for me almost the same. You're adding kind of a fruity ferment flavor at the processing stage. It's just happening earlier in the chain of coffee rather than later. So I'm not a huge fan of those flavors. I've tasted them so many times. I think they're quite, it's more or less the same fruity flavors all the time. Sometimes they can be, too wild as well, like almost tasting like stomach acid. And other times they can be really, really clean and fresh and just taste like peach juice, which, once in 100 times I can enjoy that. However, having said that, I think it's a good thing for the farmer to be able to elevate maybe his lower quality coffees into a coffee that people enjoy buying. So a very good example is Los Pirineos farm in El Salvador. Gilberto Barona, he has a farm on a volcano like this. The coffee's on top. It's really, really high quality. So he prefers to just wash those and they taste good on their own. But the coffees on the bottom, it's much lower altitude and they tend to be quite nutty and not so nice. So he's figured out if you do honey process or naturals of these coffees, he can sell them for a much higher price than he used to get. And his customers really love those coffees. So, and also he doesn't have a lot of water on his farm, so it makes a lot of sense for him to do that. So I'm not against it. It's just my personal taste is not with the naturals and honeys and carbonic macerations. Ooh, I'm talking too much. Mohsen Sadi. Tim, I figured the different temperature by checking the dwell chart and sweetness extract better in a lower temperature. What's your idea? I have to say I don't really know. I have to do experiments myself. Very interesting. Yeah, I think, continue experimenting, and then if you succeed, you should post a video about it on YouTube or whatever, so you can teach other people how to do it. Santiago Rene Castro. I know for iced you brew hot, then cool over a little bit of time. Have you tried brewing into ice to get an instant iced coffee? If so, why do you prefer the other way? Cheers from Texas. Well, I think you're referring to what people are calling the Japanese style of making iced coffee. And yeah, that can work pretty well. It's just you have to kind of compensate with having a finer grind, extract more of the kind of extract that you're making because you're diluting it with ice afterwards. This can work fine. I have nothing against it. I just find it a little bit easier just to make a really nice brew and then cool it down. Also, you don't have to calculate, how much gram of ice do I need in order to get the strength that I want and so on. So I guess I'm a little bit lazy, and that's why I do it the lazy way. But I know there's a new machine now that kind of cools it down for you, which will cool down the coffee a lot faster, and I'm hoping to try that very soon. Jeff Watson. When is Tim Wendelboe Coffee Outlet coming to Australia? Loved your coffee when I was in Oslo. Thank you, Jeff. I actually used to run a coffee chain here in Oslo before I started my own coffee shop. So I went from having one store there to running 6 stores. And that's not I didn't really enjoy it. So my answer to that is probably never. I'm probably never going to open another coffee shop. However, we did a pop-up in Sydney. When was it? It was 2 years ago when Restaurant Noma had their pop-up in Australia. We did a couple of pop-ups in different places, which was really fun. So I might do that again if the Australian government allows me to. Okay, Sebastian Martinussen, what is your favorite coffee bean area and why? Kenya, for sure, because I really like the blackcurrant flavors from the SL28 varieties that is traditionally grown there. Also, they're great at processing their coffees, so it gets sorted from when they're picking, they're sorting out all the unripes and overripes, so we only have the ripe cherries from the start. Then the traditional way of processing there is they're grading all the time, they're using gravity and water to only get the largest, heaviest beans, and then they sort them on size on the mills and so on. So you're able to buy only the large beans or only the pea berries from different lots from different cooperatives. So I think that's my favorite. The only thing that I don't like about Kenyan coffee is that it's heavily sprayed with pesticides and fungicides and also fertilizers. So I'm hoping to find a project in Kenya where we can start to look at some organic practices. But that's not going to be easy, but it's something that I really hope to do. So Chin is back. Sorry, let me explain it a little bit. When doing the pour over, some people prefer to leave 1 millimeter of thicker of coffee grounds on the paper filter to prevent the water bypass. Yes. Water bypass can be a problem in V60s, especially if your grind is too fine. So I think, I would prefer to work on the grind a little bit and the pouring time in order to prevent the bypass. Especially with the EK grinders, if you do large volumes, you can see a lot of bypass going on. So I just prefer to try to make an even extraction by not pouring too much water in and kind of controlling the flow of water. Okay, Peng Chen, I hope I'm pronouncing the names right here. Hello from Taiwan. Hello, Taiwan. I love Taiwan. I noticed that most of the coffee brewers from Europe or North America mostly use V60 as your pour-over filter. But here in Asia, we use all kinds of different pour-over filters, example Kono, Colita, Sanyo, etc. Yes. I think it's mainly due to the availability sometimes. At least here in Norway, the most available brewers are Colita and V60. And we do see a lot of Colita being used here, but I'm not sure. Maybe for me personally, I think it's easier to make a clean and crisp coffee with a V60, whereas the Colita, the filters tend to clog up a little bit sometimes, so you get kind of a fuller, richer extraction. So yeah, it's just a personal. I mean, it's water and coffee and a paper filter, so it doesn't really matter. But you have to kind of learn how to use the method of choice and experiment so that you get the coffee that you prefer. I wonder why V60 is always in Europe and North America preferred filter cup. Well, I just answered that.
Melissa, do you think automatic brewers will replace pour-over and other brew methods in coffee shops?
Melissa, yes, maybe. I think automatic brewers will replace pour-overs and other methods in coffee shops. I'm actually looking into replacing. We're using the AeroPress at the moment and have been for many years, but it's a lot of work. And we have started testing the Beacon brew, and I really like it. And we're thinking about putting it into our bar very soon. It's just I need to rebuild the bar, and since I spent all my money on a new roastery and a new lab here, it's going to take a while before I can afford to rebuild the bar again. So I do think it won't disappear entirely, because there's also some romanticism about watching people brew coffee. You know, as a customer, I kind of, when I go to restaurants, I like to watch chefs prepare food. And in the same way in coffee shops, I like to watch people prepare coffee. But if you have a very high volume cafe like us on a Saturday, we might have, 10 people in line waiting for a brewed coffee. It makes no sense at all to stand there and brew 1 and 1 cup on an AeroPress. So if we could do 2 cups on a Beacon faster than we do an AeroPress with the same results or even better with more consistency. For sure, automation is there to be used as a tool for those kind of situations.
There's a question from YouTube.
Yeah, YouTube.
They say, I have the newer Wilfa grinder. Do you have any tips on which setting would fit for Chemex and V60?
So I'm not sure if everyone knows what a Wilfa grinder is, but Wilfa is a Norwegian company, and they have kind of further developed a grinder that also Brewers used to sell. But the Wilfa grinder is heavily sold in Scandinavian and Nordic countries and UK. And it's a home grinder, quite cheap, and with conical burrs that are quite good quality. And it has a little bit different settings. It would say a filter, AeroPress, and so on. And for Chemex, normally, because the filter is quite thick, you would have to grind a little coarser in order to get the water to run through at all. The problem with any grinder is that you create a lot of fines when you grind, and the more fines, the more you block these filters. So it's kind of a little difficult. I don't brew with Chemex a lot because of this. With V60, I would go around the filter setting if you're brewing about 1 liter, but finer if you're doing half a liter. So maybe around the AeroPress setting if you're doing smaller volumes. Did that answer the question? Or Nikolai, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. What was in your coffee shop just an hour ago? Amazing stuff, man. Best espresso I had in ages. Thank you. That's not a question, but thank you anyway. Andrea Carolina Balke, hi Tim. Why, if your favorite beans are the Kenyan, you grow your own coffee in Colombia? Well, that's a good question. I bought the land in Colombia because Elias had land available for sale. I've been working with Elias. I trust him very well. He also needed money to invest in his farm. So I figured, it made sense for me to buy land from him. Also, I think Colombia has huge potential because the coffees are really good there. And the good thing is that I want to test, biological farming techniques to see if we can combat leaf rust with those techniques. And since everyone in Colombia are growing more or less the same varieties, I thought it would be a good experiment to also do like traditional captura there to see, to measure. But I would love to have land in Kenya. I don't have time to have land in Kenya, but it's a little bit more difficult in terms of ownership and stuff like that. So Colombia was a little bit easier at the moment. Well, the questions are pouring in. Honored to have a question of mine read by the man, the myth, the legend, Tim Wendelboe. Thank you for all doing that. Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Berlin, Germany, Indonesia. Yeah. Are there any more questions, Corey? You had some questions?
Yeah, we have one from YouTube.
One from YouTube.
Regarding the French press, what kind of origin bean and or roast level do you think is best for French press?
What kind of origin bean or roast level is best for French press? Well, I would answer that for any brewing method. The best origin bean can be any origin bean as long as it's really good coffee. But depends on what you like. Like if you like really fruity and floral coffees, go with the East African coffees. Kenya, Ethiopia, fantastic coffees. Also Burundi, Rwanda, a lot of people like those. If you like a little bit more earthy coffees, then go for maybe Brazilian coffees or Indian coffees, Indonesian coffees as well. If you like more like mellow, sweet, a little bit fruity, not too acidic coffees, then Central America would be the place to look for. But I would say, I'm buying 3-4 different varieties from just one farm in Central America, and they are tasting very, very different. So it really depends on the variety and so on. When it comes to roast level, I personally don't like very roasty flavors, so I always go light, but make sure that the light roast is also developed. So try to find a roaster that you really like and just explore the coffees that they have, because the chances that they are good at roasting more than just one coffee is very high. Always look for sweetness. A coffee should always be sweet, regardless of how it's roasted. So you can have sweet, dark roasted coffees. You can also have very sweet, light roasted coffees. So I think that's normally what's lacking in poorly picked, processed, or roasted coffees is sweetness.
And we had a question about how to get good coffee into the Malaysian coffee scene, the cafes. How to get good coffee into the Malaysian coffee scene?
Well, start asking for it, and I think there's a lot of good coffee in Malaysia. I haven't been to Kuala Lumpur myself, but I'm hearing that the Malaysian coffee scene is growing and there are good coffees there. But I think, with more and more roasters opening up all over the world, they will eventually be able to buy better coffees. First of all, through importers. There are more and more importers around, but also as they grow, probably they will start to travel a little bit and buy coffees from other countries. And there's, I think, huge potential in Asia for growing good coffees. I was just in China last year and tasted some amazing Chinese coffees. I've tasted good Taiwanese coffees. I just tasted a really interesting geisha from Thailand last week. So, start looking in your own backyard, because there are potential for sure.
From Gareth in Berlin, sieve or no sieve? Do you see any place for this in a modern coffee bar?
To sieve coffee or not to sieve coffee? That is the question. Well, I would say if you can find a use for the fines that you sieve out or the boulders that you sieve out, then go ahead and sieve coffee. But if you throw it out in the trash, I would not do that at all. It's a waste of resources. There's a lot of work behind picking and roasting and exporting and importing good coffee, and throwing it in the trash is really disrespectful. But if you can find a use for, let's say you sieved out the boulders, so the bigger particles from the coffee, maybe you could use that for brewing cold brew, for instance. Or if you sieve out the fines, I would probably use those in ice cream, for instance. It will taste great as a kind of it gets a little chocolatey, and sometimes they stick together and so on. But I think it's quite impractical to do sieving, so I rely on better grinders and good brewing techniques in order to brew better coffee.
Should we just do one last question and then we'll sign off?
Let's do another 5 minutes. We said 30 minutes, let's do another 5. So let's go through some other questions.
So from Mosin, why in cone-shaped filters you have more acidity rather than flat-based filters like Colita?
So why the cone-shaped filter like in V60 has more acidity than the Colita, which is flatbed? I personally don't think there is a difference. as long as you know how to brew them both. But I would say that the V60 filters tend to get the water through the filter a little bit faster than the Colita. Maybe because the kind of mesh or the microns tolerance for the filters are different, I don't know. But I see that the Colita filters tend to kind of get clogged by the fines a little bit faster than the V60 filters. So I think that's the difference. So we would just have to adjust your pouring technique. So a lot of people here in Norway who like bright and acidic coffees, I see them pouring a lot of water into the Colita filter in the first 2 pours, and then just have a little bit at the end. Whereas with the V60, they can pour a little bit, more spread out and have the same flavor results. And I did some experiments with Mons Akne Andersson a couple of years ago, where we actually managed to brew very, very similar coffees on both of them. It's just different techniques. Next question.
Okay, hi Tim, tell us please a little about the cafe, tradition, recipes, and how it was used. Your recent video brought some light on that traditional method, but I want to know more. From Janina. Okay,
Janina. So kokekaffe is a traditional, I would say, Nordic way of making coffee, but also heavily used in America. If you watch a Western movie, they will always boil a kettle of water on the bonfire and then put coffee in it. So the way to do it is to boil the water in the kettle. I normally take the kettle off the heat source, wait maybe a minute to get the temperature down to maybe like 95, 96. Then you would use 70 grams of coffee per liter of water, put it into the water, stir it around a little bit, a crustal form, and just leave the kettle for 4, 5, 6 minutes. And then at the end, people would kind of dunk the kettle in order to get the grounds to settle to the bottom. I just use a spoon so I can skim off the foam, because that always tastes bitter. And then you let the kettle settle for another 5 minutes to kind of clarify the liquid. And then you just pour into the cups carefully so you don't get too much grounds into the cups. And this coffee is delicious. And especially if you're out in a forest doing camping, it's highly recommendable. It's very, very nice. Just don't do it right now if you live in Norway, because we have had very dry weather. So don't start a bonfire. You will burn down the whole country. Okay.
Next question from Ken. Hey Tim, the water from the tap has too much chalk in it.
Calcium. Yeah.
So I use bottled water. What kind of water should I use for my filter coffee? With a lot of minerals or less?
So, Ken, when you use bottled water, look for the mineral content on the labels. I try to use waters that have less than 150 milligrams of total mineral content per liter of water. But in my preference, the softer the better. Distilled water is not so good, because then you get very astringent flavors. But try to use very, very soft waters. And be careful with the alkalinity. So if there's too much calcium carbonate, it'll neutralize the acidities in the coffee. So that's why, softer water normally works much better than hard water. So look for that. You can also check out Maxwell Colonna Dashwood recently published on Kickstarter a new water filter system that is for home use. Like, it's a little jug that is specially designed for problem water like that. And it'll be out soon. You can back it up on Kickstarter still, I think. And it should be a very affordable way to filter your coffee water for coffee. And we actually invested in it through Kickstarter, and we'll be getting maybe 50 of those water filter jugs that we will be selling online once they are made. So look for that. That will be a cheaper option for you in the long run.
Question from YouTube.
2 more questions, and then we go off, I think.
Okay, great. If you're going to stir coffee, should you wait until the second pour during pour over?
If you're going to stir coffee when you're making pour over, a lot of people like to stir the coffee while doing the bloom. However, if you don't pour enough water into the bloom, nothing really happens. So when you do a bloom, we have to remember that coffee absorbs about twice its weight in water. So if you have 50 grams of coffee, you should pour 100 grams of water, and it should absorb most of that. So that means if you don't have enough water, you don't really do anything when you stir. So let's say I have 30 grams of coffee in a filter, and I want to stir during the blooming session, I would probably pour something around 80 to 100 grams of water and then stir. The problem with this is a lot of the water will just run through the filter very fast, so you have to kind of experiment a little bit what works with your grind setting. It's perfectly fine to do it on the second pour as well. Just remember that every time you stir, after kind of the blooming period, you will extract more and more of the coffee. So stirring makes extraction go up very fast. Think of it as when you're having a tea bag in a teacup. If you don't touch it, nothing really happens. But if you start stirring the tea bag around, you see color coming out very, very fast. That's the same thing happening with coffee, and that's extraction. Should we do the last question?
Jordy, many recipes around for people to make their own water for coffee. Do you have a favorite recipe, or do you think the impact is not as big as people think?
So that's a great question to end on, Jordy. I don't really fool around with recipes for water when it comes to coffee brewing, because the water in Oslo is really, really, really good for brewing coffee. So I just use tap water. And that's why I don't really know that much about water and mineral content and so on, because it's not a big issue here in Norway. So I would actually recommend to kind of talk to the people who have these problems, like in Denmark, Coffee Collective, Maxwell Colonna, who is doing a lot of research on water. And yeah, I would also just check out different recipes that are online and test it with the coffee that you prefer to brew, and then you will find your favorite recipe. I think that's it for this session. We'll probably do a couple of other sessions because there was a lot of people asking questions. I'm really sorry I didn't have to or couldn't answer all of them. It just went a little too fast. It's hard to read every single one. But yeah, I think we should try to schedule another one, right, Corey? And Corey, come around so people can see who's sitting on the other side here. Corey is our substitute marketing manager. And our real marketing manager, Krista, is on maternity leave, so she will be back in a couple of months. Until then, Corey will help me do these sessions. Maybe we should do one on roasting, I don't know, but let's maybe ask the audience what they want to hear. So,
make sure to like this so your friends will see it.
Yeah, make sure to like this so your friends will see it. That's what Corey tells me to say. So thank you for joining, and I really hope you enjoyed the session. You will probably be able to watch it on Facebook later as well. That's it for now. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.